Okay, welcome to the lecture about the Old Kingdom in Egypt. We're looking at this picture, and what we're seeing is a couple of things. First off, obviously the lights are not contemporary to when the pyramids were built. But also what we're seeing with the pyramids is the inside of the pyramids and not the way that it looked when they were originally made. So there were white finishing stones on the outside. Whereas what we see today, most of the white finishing stones have been removed, and we see the inside of the pyramid. That's why it looks all rough and almost looks like rubble, because it is basically. When they were originally made, and I'll show you reproductions later on, they were very, very smooth and perfect. Also, part of the top has worn off or perhaps been removed. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So the pyramid that we looked at in the first slide didn't just come about suddenly. There were steps that got us to that point. So what we're looking at here is the step pyramid of King Djoser, or Djoser. Sometimes it's spelled with a Djoser. And this is the first monumental stone architecture in the world. So what that means is it is the first architecture that was made to memorialize a person. So that's what they mean by monumental. A particular person that we have the name of. There were certainly things that were made before where we don't have the names. And according to Lawler, this particular tomb set the standard for future pharaonic tombs. It is constructed in a necropolis of Saqqara to house the tomb of King Djoser, who was in the third dynasty. And this is what we're going to see in general. Like a lot of times when you see the pyramids in popular culture, you just see the pyramid itself, but all of them were part of a complex that served the king in the afterlife. And by the way, when I say pharaoh and king, those are the same word. They are equivalent. So this particular piece was designed by Imhotep, who is the world's first architect and hence artist known by name. Again, there had been artists for thousands of years that we'd seen last week, but this is the first one where we actually have a name of them. And Imhotep was worshipped after he died, similarly to the way that the kings would be. So how this thing was constructed is it used to be that the pharaohs were buried in a pretty similar way to other elite people, so other royalty and people that had high status in ancient Egyptian society. So it began as a mastaba. And, you know, the pharaohs, they would have ones that were maybe bigger, but Imhotep wanted to do something a little bit different to set the pharaoh off from everybody else. So what he did is he took the mastaba and basically made a layer cake. So you can see that with D. And then what happens with every pharaoh is as soon as they rise to the throne, they start building their tomb. So Djoser survived after they finished the D part. So they decided to expand it and make it bigger. So there is a burial vault that is 92 feet underground. If you look at the right picture, you can see how there was all of these shafts that were leading into nowhere, supposedly, possibly some Indiana Jones style traps and booby traps to stop people from robbing the grave. So you could look at this and say, wow, this is amazing, all these measures that they took to stop it from getting robbed. So did it work? Of course it didn't work. If you look at all the pyramids, what they basically are big blinking signs that say, rob me, I am full of treasure and riches. So all of the pyramids were robbed, some in ancient times. But all of them at least 1,000 years ago. So the final work resembles a ziggurat of Mesopotamia. You can look that up and check that out if you would like to find something to put on the extra credit board. Post a picture of that and maybe talk about how you think the ziggurat and the step pyramid resembles each other. So like I said, this is part of a complex, and they call this a city of the dead, a necropolis. So the pyramid was just one part of a funerary complex in which the king could continue his duties and rituals in the afterlife. And all of these complexes were in a perfect north, south, and east and west. and that had spiritual significance. So when you look at the complex, we're not going to look at every part of it, but just some of the more relevant ones. We can see again, it's perfect north, south, east, and west. We have the pyramid in the middle here. And what I want to concentrate on is the said festival court. That's this right here, and the crescent-shaped markers. So what a pharaoh would do, and you can see it's about 75 meters between these markers here. So what a pharaoh would do is after they rule for a certain period of time, it may have been like 30 years or so, then they would have to renew their kingship. And how they would do that is they would ritually die and they'd be wrapped up like a mummy, and then they would rise again. After they rose again, they would walk between these two markers that are in perfect north and south, representing Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. So certainly some of these pharaohs would be pretty old when they have to do this in real life. So I'm sure everybody reported that they did it very easily, even if they were hobbling when they did it. So when you look at this picture, it's showing the king running between the territorial markers. And in the funeral complex, where you can do this forever, is shown as being 75 meters apart. In this one, we see the king taking that 75 meters in one big old stride. So some of the symbols that you see in here, and this is very early again, we're talking about the Third Dynasty, would continue throughout Egyptian history and being used all the way up to Cleopatra VII. So the first one is the Ankh, and it's probably the one you're most familiar with. It's been pretty accepted in popular culture. And on the slide, I have it equaling life. But a better way to say that is that it is life force. The Ankh is what makes life possible. So we'll see later pharaohs will take that idea of the Ankh and life force and having it bestowed on them by a god, and then they can distribute this life force to the rest of Egypt. So remember, the pharaohs thought of themselves as gods and that they provide everything that is good for Egypt. So they are the life force that makes Egypt happen. And then we have here this thing that looks like a scepter or a staff. Is called the Was, and that represents the pharaoh's dominion. So over Upper and Lower Egypt, and then when they expand into an empire, into those expanded spaces. So kind of interestingly and somewhat, gross, is that there was actual Was scepters, and they were made out of a bull phallus. There's a pretty cool semi-academic magazine called KMT, and I read an article years back where someone actually made one of these Was scepters with a bull phallus, and not a super easy thing to do. And although that might sound kind of gross or weird, remember when we were looking at Narmer earlier, he had associated himself with the bull, with the male power of the bull, and also as a symbol of plenty for Egyptians. So although it seems kind of weird or gross to make it out of a bull phallus, this is something that would happen. And also interestingly, up until now, it had been a kind of tradition, especially in British lands, and Egypt would later become one of those lands, to include bull testicles at the top of a staff or a cane when people used to carry those things as a symbol of wealth or of being particularly sophisticated. So the last one is the Shen, and that's here, this circle. And just like in most societies, the circle represents something that has no beginning and no end. So the Shen represents eternity. Egyptian pharaohs, when their bodies were found, they often had Shen rings on their fingers, and sometimes they were wrapped up with their mummy as well. We can also see in this picture that the pharaoh is wearing everything that you would expect from a pharaoh. He's wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. He's wearing a strap-on beard. Ancient Egyptians that were elites shaved their body from head to toe. Was a way to prevent lice. So this beard would be fake. And then he's holding the flail, which is an agricultural implement. Again, remember associating himself with agriculture and plenty. The thing he's holding in his left hand is a mystery. They stopped using it early in the Old Kingdom, so we don't know exactly what it means. So after running between the markers, and again, they're really old, maybe it was more hobbling, between the markers, the king would first go to the South Palace to be crowned king of Upper Egypt, and then continue to the North Palace to be crowned king of Lower Egypt. So again, this idea of uniting Lower and Upper Egypt continued long after the supposed uniting of these two areas. So when you look at the North or South Palace, they are made to represent things that were architectures that existed in real life, but were made out of ephemeral materials, so materials that don't last a very long time. So these ones are made out of stone, and they will last forever, but they don't, they're kind of like the stone wall is being held up here by the bricks, not like the columns would be in real life. So the columns are here, they're symbolic. This is so that the pharaoh can do what he did in life for the rest of time. And the types of decorations that you see on each palace also represent this idea of Upper and Lower Egypt. So engaged columns along the exterior wall of the North Palace represent papyrus bundles, and papyrus blossoms serve as capitals. So papyrus grows in the Nile Delta region, which is far in the north. So they have that representing that idea in the North Palace. So against the north side of the pyramid, facing the imperishable stars in the northern sky amongst which the king hoped to pass eternity, was built the Funerary Temple where the daily rituals and offerings for the dead king could be performed. So you're probably wondering like how they oriented these things. We'll kind of talk about how they used the stars to orient things perfectly north, south, east, and west. So now getting to the pyramids, there was actually a few steps between the step pyramid and this one of trying to get a smooth-sided pyramid, all of which failed to a certain extent. And you can look those up if you're looking for something to put on the extra credit board. One of them was called the bent pyramid. You can check that out again and put it on the extra credit board if you so desire. It was built, these pyramids were built by the Dynasty 4 kings, Khufu, who's the oldest, and built the largest pyramid, which is in the background. Khafre, that's this pyramid right here. And then Menkaure, a much, much smaller pyramid, although it's not very clear in this picture. And these were the first true pyramids, as in ones that were smooth-sided and straight all the way to the top. As far as the shape of the pyramid, the Egyptians didn't necessarily, in the Old Kingdom, we don't have a lot of documentation. So we're not sure exactly. So this is partially speculation, but educated speculation. So the shape of the pyramid may be an imitation of the sun's rays. When we get to the New Kingdom, we'll have a better illustration of that sort of thing. The king could climb up the rays in the afterlife to join the sun god Ra. The shape also resembles the Ben stone in Heliopolis. Heliopolis means sun city, which was the center of the sun cult. The pharaohs of this dynasty were the first kings to refer to themselves as the sons of Ra. And they meant this quite literally. Whenever they looked at the pharaoh, they looked at the pharaoh's mother. And by the way, the pharaoh's mother would be the second most important person in Egypt after the pharaoh. She would often, instead of being called the pharaoh's mother, she'd be called the god's mother or something like that. What they believed is that Ra came into the bedchamber of the god's mother and impregnated her, not the previous pharaoh, but Ra did this. And then when the pharaoh was born, they were hence half god and half man. So the pharaohs, when they looked at themselves as gods, they meant while they were on earth, not just after they died. So these pharaohs kind of made this distinction during this time period. Whether regular people believe this, I can't really say, but they did build these giant man-made mountains. So either they were getting paid or they believed something or a combination of the both. So this is a reproduction that gives you a little bit of an idea of what the pyramids originally looked like. They were originally finished with gleaming white limestone, which is still around, but most of it was taken to make other structures later on. The king's body was brought to the Valley Temple by boat. If you visit Cairo today and go to this area where Giza plain, where the pyramids are, you'll notice that this particular structure is no longer along the Nile. The Nile, like other huge and powerful rivers, moves over time. So it's been 4,500 years. The Nile no longer comes right up to it. But at the time it was built, it did. So the king's body would be taken in here. They would be prepared. And we'll talk about mummification a little bit later on. And then eventually they would be taking up what's called the causeway. You can see here. And in each step, there would be a more and more elite crowd that would be involved in this. So when you have the Valley Temple right here, you might have some of the king's family and some other elites that were involved in the ceremonies here. But once you get to the causeway, it's only a few people. The people carrying the king's body, the high priest, maybe the next pharaoh, if they know who that is. And through here, you can see there's a hole on the top. They didn't, they had to bring candles in there because it was very dark. So that was to allow them to be able to breathe. And then they would bring it to the Funerary Temple. And again, this would be only a few people that would be allowed in this space. So the fourth dynasty funerary complexes had a different purpose than the one at Saqqara. The king's funerary monuments no longer catered for the king's eternal reenactment of the territorial rituals of kingship. So that the king became an earthly manifestation of the sun god, expressed in the form of the king's filial relationship to Ra. Filial means like brotherly. And at death, he joined the sun god in his eternal cycle of renewal. So much more interesting than what the complex at Djoser was trying to accomplish, which was just to do things as they had done in life. Instead, they truly become part of the gods, and they cycle between the underworld gods and the gods of the heavens. So this is a really interesting find because the pyramids are huge structures, and since the time they were built, they were known by people that visited. So it's amazing to find something recently, relatively recently, this is 1954, around the pyramids, since there have been digs there for a long time. So this is called a solar boat. And the idea with this was that it was made to assist the king's spirit in the journey through the heavens with Ra. And the boat was discovered in 1954 in a pit adjacent to Khufu's pyramid in thousands of pieces and reassembled. This is the picture of the actual boat that was buried next to the pyramid. This is a picture of a reproduction, so you can get an idea of what the whole thing looked like. It's very long and thin, so it's hard to get a picture of the actual thing. It's 43 meters long. For those of you that are American, we're talking about 140 feet or so, and 5.6 meters wide. And it's constructed of cedar imported from Lebanon. So this shows the reach of the Egyptian empire at this time. And by the way, those cedar trees are still existent in the highlands in Lebanon today. So this type of boat was very similar to the type of boat that fishermen and people that were traveling through the Nile would use. When you went on a river, you want to have something that is very narrow so you can navigate the rivers a little bit more easily. In Egypt today, sometimes people use these boats for tourism or such. So it's kind of interesting. This thing made to go in the Nile, but for the pharaoh, it's made to go through the heavens. And again, if you're looking for something to put on the extra credit board, why was it made out of cedar? If you think of it as a boat, that might help you a little bit. And we'll talk about cedar a little bit later on as well. So this is the interior of Khufu's pyramid, and this is just a start because there might be other interior spaces we're not aware of. We'll kind of talk about a little bit later on. When we look at the entrance here, we're not talking about the entrance that was used to actually bring the king's body in, but one that was used by a robber in about 1,000 years ago or so. If you visit the pyramid today, you'll go in through the robber's entrance. But this part, the grand gallery, which is very unusual at the top here, that is how you will will approach, and that's how originally the pharaoh's body was brought out. There's this additional chamber, so perhaps a place to store the king in case he dies while the pyramid is being built, or perhaps for somebody else, or they decide to move it once they had started the pyramid. And then many additional chambers. You can see with this chamber in the middle, they have all of these relieving stones, and I'm going to give you a link to a video explaining what that's about a little bit more, in a little bit more of a detailed manner. But the idea is like basically what we have is a man-made mountain with millions of metric tons of stone above it. So having this tiny chamber, which is lined with granite, which is a very hard stone, the pyramid builders quickly realized that could be a problem. They found cracks in the granite stone. So they created this to kind of like, to make a sort of arch. And what these two do, and then these kind of stones that are relieving, they spread out the energy of all this rock above and stop it from collapsing. It worked. It's still a very safe space that you can go to today. Obviously, nothing was left in it. Everything was robbed. There wasn't a thing that was found in it in modern times. So as far as what the shafts that lead out to it mean, this is really speculation. Like the earlier complexes, is perfect north, south, east, and west. One shaft points to Thuban, which is the North Star of the Old Kingdom. Right now, the North Star is Sirius, but 4,500 years ago, Thuban was, and in the future, Thuban will be the North Star again. And what the North Star means, basically, is a star that is oriented so that when the Earth goes around the sun, it seems to stay in place while the other stars seem to spin around in a circle. So it's like a still star just because of its placement. And it allows you to orient yourself towards north. It's not perfect north, but it's pretty close. So a shaft points to Orion's belt. As far as whether or not that was significant, not known. So that's just kind of a guess. The shaft thus served as a kind of escape hatch that allowed the pharaoh to take his place as a star in the cosmos. That's what Jansen says, but again, we're not sure exactly, but it would make sense with the types of stories in Books of the Dead that they had told about pharaohs in later times. So we're not sure exactly what it meant. So this is a burgeoning area of research and trying to figure out what these chambers were for and if there's more of them, something that's still going on today. So how were the pyramids built? We don't actually know because what's interesting is that at this time, the ancient Egyptians only had stone and copper tools, and copper is a very soft metal, no wheel. So they in later times, they had wheels, and we'll see them like with chariots and such. But at this time, they didn't have wheels. And so the closest thing is maybe rollers. And many of the blocks were perfectly fitted, especially these limestone blocks here where they seem to be perfectly smooth. So the idea is that the assumption is that they're carved stones dragged with ramps using rollers. But the problem is there's no evidence of ramps and we don't see any tools or anything. So the big problem with this is that the sides of the pyramid are very steep. And given the size of the stones, it would be impossible with rollers to be able to drag the stones up the side of the pyramid. So they had to have used some sort of ramp, which could be no more than 7 or 8 or 7 and 9 degrees steepness. So it is highly unlikely that there would have been a ramp that was a straight ramp, because that would actually be at 7 to 9 degrees larger than the construction of all the pyramids put together. So there had to be some other way of doing it. And next week, I'm going to give you a link to a video and also the link to another video with another idea. And we're going to try to determine which one seems the most convincing. Again, we don't know, and this is a research that's being done, so we can't be sure. So another idea is it would be really difficult to bring the stones whole up. So in an article that was written in a geophysical map journal, a geology journal, written by Barsom, Gangley, and Hug, that instead of using stones that were carved out of a quarry, that they used reconstituted blocks, and that was basically concrete. And this would be very convenient because if your concrete is basically just rubble, water, and something sticky. So you could bring small bags of rubble and actually drag them up the pyramid, and then you could have forms where you could pour all of the ingredients together and to be able to make these reconstituted blocks. So again, I'll give you a video for each idea, and we'll try to determine which one seems the most convincing. That'll be next week. So on to sculpture. And the sculpture we're looking at is quite a sculpture indeed. This is the Great Sphinx. And the dates there are provisional because we're not sure exactly who built it. So the dates there, we don't know. But it is giant, 66 feet high and 240 feet long. We know it's a pharaoh because he's wearing a Neme's headdress, and only the pharaoh can wear this. And the Sphinx was associated with the sun god. So let's look at it from another angle. And what you're looking at here, this is all original, except for these bricks along the side and some of these bricks here. So in the 19th century, when the British Empire had expanded and they had taken over Egypt, the Sphinx was buried in sand up to here. Of course, the English always want to take stuff from the places that they take over, so they unburied it. And when they did, these different layers of stone began to wear away in different ways. So as a result, you're seeing that some layers of stone wear away a lot and some less. So some of these bricks were added later on to stop it from collapsing. And this is something that research will have to figure out so that the whole thing doesn't collapse. But what this does show you is something that's very amazing. The Sphinx used to be a hill. And this was all rocks. And how it was made is it was carved downwards out of the living rock, so out of the rock that was in place. So all of this area here would have been a hill, and all of this is rock that was originally there, and they carved the Sphinx out of it. Obviously, when we're seeing this part of the Sphinx, there's not a lot of detail, and some of it's worn off because he's been facing the wind for so long. But when it was originally made, it would have been highly detailed. We'll see Sphinxes later on and get an idea of what they look like. So the Sphinx guarded the processional way from the Valley Temple to the Funerary Temple. That's one idea. The location of the Sphinx suggests that it represented Khafre himself. It also faces the rising sun, which reinforces association with the pharaoh. So that's the idea if it's guarding the Valley Temple. According to Jansen, the Sphinx is Khufu. And according to Reader, he's the only Egyptologist in all this group. It predates Khufu. So Reader thinks that this structure was made before the pyramids and might represent an earlier pharaoh. So looking at more like smaller Old Kingdom sculpture, this is a seated statue of Khafre from Giza. It's made of diorite, which is an extremely hard stone, and very hard stones would only be used for the pharaoh. So diorite and granite, that would be reserved for the pharaoh. And it's 5 feet 6 inches high, so this is pretty massive. If you're sitting and you're 5 feet 6 inches high, you're very large. The pharaoh probably wasn't this large in real life. So the sculpture was found in the Valley Temple of Khafre's pyramid complex. Its function is to embody the Ka, the spirit of the king. The priests of Khafre's cult would make offerings to the statue. So when you see the statue, you can see it's obviously like beautiful and aesthetically pleasing. But this statue, once it was made, it would not be seen by anybody, even the priests of Khafre's cult. It was kept in what was basically a closet with a door, and the door had a tiny hole in it. And it was not for people to look in at the sculpture, but instead for Khafre's spirit to look outwards. So even though this is beautiful and was very difficult to make, it wasn't for display. It was to embody the spirit of the king. And that's something to remember with almost all Egyptian artworks. Even though they are beautiful and aesthetic, at the same time, they have a spiritual purpose, and that's why they were made. So Egyptian artists followed certain conventions, both for sculptures in the round, that means three-dimensional ones, or in the relief, that means two-dimensional ones that are kind of carved into the two-dimensional surface. The more important the personage represented, the more rigorously the conventions were observed. So you can kind of look at this and take the extra credit board and think about what are the conventions. Like, I think an easy way to start with this is to remember that Khafre didn't look like this. So identify the characteristics of this particular figure and see if you can determine how pharaohs look in art, what the conventions are, in other words. So in this one, he's reaching for offerings in his left hand, and his right hand holds that unknown royal regalia that would not be used later on. So Khafre wears the Nimi's headdress. That's this. Only a pharaoh wears it. And then it has your uraeus, which is the rearing cobra symbol of Ra. So remember, they consider themselves to be the sons of Ra. His throne is decorated with an intertwining plants that represent Upper and Lower Egypt, which is known as the semi-Tawi motif. And this will be used through all of Egyptian history right up to Cleopatra VII, 2,500 years later. So these are the lotus and the papyrus, and they represent, again, uniting Upper and Lower Egypt. So a visual theme for that. And then the diorite was from Nubia, and kind of like the cedar from Lebanon, it's showing the extent of Egypt's power at this particular time. So this one, another thing you can kind of do on the extra credit board is compare and contrast these two figures. On the left, we have the pharaoh. On the right, we have the pharaoh's wife. It's usually thought of, but you may think differently. If you go to the extra credit board and somebody kind of thinks about who else this could represent, I'll let you know if that's what some other researchers are thinking. So comparing and contrasting these would give you an idea on how the feminine and the masculine are portrayed in ancient Egypt. So this is Menkaure and his wife, although there's other ideas about who this could be as well. It illustrates the differences and conventions between the portrayal of men and women. One comparison you'll be able to make is the queen is a little bit smaller, and that's part of hierarchic scale. She's less important than the king in Egyptian society. And then what I mean by naturalistic in this case just means softer. But you may find more specifics that you could put on the extra credit board that might be interesting. So the sculpture we're looking at previously of the king and his wife would have been painted exactly as this one. When you have hard, smooth stones, the paint tends to come off more easily. So this is Prince Reotep and his wife, Nafret. And you'll notice that they're painted in different colors. And this is an artistic convention. Again, these figures don't represent the way that people looked in real life. They are representations of their roles. So men were portrayed in this kind of like red-brown color, and women were portrayed in this very light kind of yellowish color. This doesn't mean that men were outdoors getting suntans or that men had darker skin than women. Both of these people would have a skin tone that's probably darker than the person here. These are simply conventions to represent gender for elite people. But you'll notice that this is made of limestone. It's smaller, even though it's the same type of format. It's 3 feet 11 inches high, and limestone is a much softer stone. So Prince Reotep, not the pharaoh, he does have a great mustache, and being portrayed in a way that is slightly less elite than the pharaoh. You also notice with the paint that they both are wearing eye makeup, so that's something that men and women did. And again, we have their bodies shaved from head to toe. That would be the same thing with queens and princesses. They'd be wearing wigs. Oh, and one other thing I should mention is the shear garment. If you look carefully, when this would have been painted, it would have been more obvious, but this is what the queen or the female figure in here is wearing, a very particular type of thin linen garment that was made for elites. So the last sculpture we're going to look at is the seated scribe. And you can kind of look at this and think, again, like the pharaoh, the scribe didn't necessarily look like this. the way he's portrayed isn't a personal portrayal. Rather, it's a portrayal of his role in society. So a scribe, you might just think of someone like a court reporter or somebody who writes down notes or the minutes of a meeting. But this is more than that. Scribes would be well-educated. They study law, mathematics, and religion. The fact that this person has a tomb would show that they were an elite scribe. So they would be like, presidents of the United States, not the current one necessarily, but maybe the previous one, will have these people from elite schools that will advise them. That's a similar type of role that this person would have. And the paint has lasted. So we can see the kind of red-brown color. It's a convention for portraying men. So one thing you can do is kind of look at the characteristics of this figure and try to figure out what they might communicate. You take the extra credit board and try and do that. When you get in close, you notice the eyes, which are made out of faience. This is not supposed to be that the figure had blue eyes. Some people in North Africa have kind of like gray blue eyes, but that's not what they're trying to represent here. That was just the color that they could get with this glassy type of material. So they used that to get a very realistic looking eye. And with this picture, kind of look at the face, and you can compare the face to the pharaoh and to the prince, and kind of see if you see any differences in the way that the faces are portrayed. So this is a side view. You can really get an idea of what his body is like. So again, you can use this as part of your comparison with the pharaoh. So what are the differences between a seated scribe and king? Again, you can take the extra credit board and share some of your views on it. And then, I can respond to it and we can see what people come up with.